Okay, so today we're going to talk about developmental psychology. Now, developmental psychology, there's a lot of information in this chapter. I teach a whole semester class on developmental psychology. So I have to kind of condense it down into, 1 week's worth of lectures. So I know it's a lot of information, and I'll try to keep it to, what you need to focus on. The book's going to give you a lot of information as well. But again, remember, if you go through the book and you look at what I cover in class, that's what you need to focus on and study. Because if I cover it in the lecture and it's in the book, then it's likely it's going to be on the test. So if you don't understand something, you always have the book to back you up. And remember that the book is where I get the multiple choice questions from. So the book is always a good reference, and it's free now. So there's no reason to not look at the book or read the information in the book. So, developmental psychology goes from conception until death. So, we cover everything that a person goes through in that time, from the time of conception to death. So, it goes through your cognitive development. Remember, your cognitive development has to do with your thinking, your thought processes, your biology, your emotional, psychological development, physical development. It just covers everything. And one of the themes throughout developmental psychology that's kind of always there is the nature-nurture controversy. Now, the nature-nurture controversy, for those of you that don't remember, is the idea that we are both, where does something come from, like your intelligence, your personality? Does it come from nature, which is what Mother Nature gave you, what you were born with, your genetics? Or does it come from nurture, which is the environment? In most cases, with developmental psychology, most people believe that who we are, what we are, our intelligence, our personality is both a combination of nature and nurture. Some are more heavily in the nature side, some more heavily in the nurture side. And depending on the theory that you read or believe in, is going to emphasize usually one or the other more so. But most things are an interaction of both. Now, like I said, with developmental psychology, we go through all the stages. So we have prenatal, then infant, then early child, middle child, adolescence, early adult, middle adult, late adult, and death and dying. Okay, so we have all these different phases to cover. And we look at, like I said, with developmental psychology, different types of development. So there's three theorists that the main theorists, the founders of developmental psychology, and the different areas that they cover. One is Piaget. Now, we've covered Piaget in this class, and we talk a lot about cognition. Remember, anything that has to do with your thinking, your thought processes, that has to do with cognition. And Piaget is the theorist that covers that. His theory we talked about him a little bit with intelligence testing. Remember, he was the one who was helping Binet give the intelligence test and discovered that that all 5-year-olds give the wrong answers to the 7-year-old questions, but they give the same wrong answer. And that gave him the idea that although 5-year-olds don't think correctly, they're all thinking the same way. And that's how he formulated and studied children to look at the different stages of development that they go through, so that all 5-year-olds are thinking alike, all 10-year-olds are thinking alike. So he has these developmental stages. Now, remember with Piaget, he talked about how we are born, pretty much putting things into schemas or categories, and then we get a new stimulus from the environment, and we have to decide to either assimilate or accommodate. This should sound familiar. We talked a lot about this when we went over the section on intelligence. So he has to assimilate or accommodate. So the child gets a new stimulus, and they have a category for what's edible and not edible. So they get a new stimulus and they have to decide, does it go in the edible category or the not edible category? So if they get, let's say an item and they put it in their mouth to decide if it's edible or not edible, and they decide that it goes into the edible category, the edible schema, then what that means is that they're assimilating the item. And we talked about assimilation and accommodation. So with assimilation, it means putting it into an already existing schema. Now, if they get an item and they put it in their mouth and let's say it's a rattle and category, but then when they move it, it makes a noise. And they say, okay, that's different. I'm going to create a whole new schema for noisemakers. That's accommodation. So when you get a new item and you either assimilate it, put into an already existing schema, or accommodate and change the schema, create a whole new schema, then that means that you accommodate the item. Okay. And so all along, we're getting these new items all throughout our lives. We need the stimulation from the environment so that we can decide to either assimilate or accommodate. And that's where, remember, the intellectual growth comes in. So we need interaction with the environment so that we can decide to assimilate or accommodate and have intellectual growth. And so Piaget takes this and then has different developmental stages. Now, you don't have to memorize them in order, but we are going to talk about the developmental stages. And again, if it's something that I talk about, then it's something that you need to know for the exam. Okay, the next theorist that comes up a lot in developmental psychology is Erikson. Erikson. Okay. Now, Erikson talks about psychosocial development. So, how the environment, how our society interacts with us and causes us or has us affects our development. So he's looking more at our personality development as opposed to our cognitive development, which Piaget is looking at. And Erikson, his developmental stages start in infancy, early on as an infant, and then go throughout the whole entire lifespan until late adulthood. He has his final stage. Erikson believed at each stage there's a crisis, and we are trying to, how our social environment affects us is going to determine which side of that crisis we end up on. Okay. So for example, for Erikson, the first stage in infancy is trust versus mistrust. So the child is trying to will either develop a sense of trust in society that people will take care of them, will be there for them, or a sense of mistrust. So when an infant is born, and infancy is the first 2 years of life, the child's needs are met. So they are, when they're hungry, they're fed, people take care of them. When they cry, somebody comes and helps them. They change their diaper. They help them grow and develop. They're there for them. Then the child will learn to trust society, to trust people. Okay. If nobody is there, the baby cries and nobody comes, nobody feeds it when the baby's hungry, just feeds it whenever they want to, and the baby's needs don't get met, then the infant is going to learn to mistrust. Now, whichever side you end up on, trust versus mistrust, and again, at each stage, there's a different crisis that stays with you the rest of your life. Now, Erikson believed that let's say you're in infancy and you developed mistrust. So you learn not to trust people. You go through your life. And when you get here to early adulthood, sorry about that, you need to learn, what you're trying to do in early adulthood is develop intimate relationships. And this is emotional intimacy. And you can't do that if you don't trust people. So what happened here in early infancy is going to affect you in your later development as well. Now, Erikson was optimistic. He believed that even if we ended up on the, let's say, negative side of the crisis, that we could still overcome it. So we could go to therapy or other things could happen. So for example, let's say you're an infant and your parents don't take care of you, they neglect you. And so, let's say it's 2 years old, you get taken away from them. Now you have a sense of mistrust because nobody's been there for you, nobody's taking care of you. But you get adopted by a really good family, or somebody, your new parents, your foster parents take really good care of you. At first, you're not going to trust them, but you can learn to develop trust by getting this better care, and then end up on the side of trust, so that when you get later in life, then you can trust people and things are better. Okay, so that's Erikson's theory. The third theorist that we talk a lot about in developmental psychology is Freud. Now, we've talked about Freud some as well. Remember, Freud is all about the sex, so his stages are called psychosexual stages. Now, your book is, and some other introduction books, put all of Freud's developmental theory in the chapter on personality. So Freud has developmental stages, which we go through through adolescence, but they're not covered until the chapter on personality. So although Freud has developmental stages, we're going to talk about them when we get to the chapter on personality theory. Okay, so we're going to then start with prenatal development. There. Okay, prenatal development, this is from the time of conception until conception is when the egg and the sperm unite, and when they unite, they create a zygote. So we have a zygote, and then that's when the cell starts to divide and develop. Sorry. The conception happens in the fallopian tube, so the egg gets released from the woman, the sperm come up and swim into the fallopian tubes, they unite there. And then what happens is the egg kind of floats around, it kind of comes down the fallopian tube, it's in the uterus, this takes about 7 days, and then it implants. So let me see, I'm not very good at drawing, but I'm gonna see if I can give you kind of a picture of what's going on. So if these are the ovaries, this is the fallopian tubes, and this is the uterus, what happens is the egg gets released here, the sperm swims up, conception happens here in the fallopian tube. We now have a zygote, and then this zygote floats around for about a week, and then it implants itself into the uterus. Now, when this zygote is floating around for a week, technically the woman is not pregnant because it hasn't implanted in her. So there's no biological changes in her. She has no idea there's a zygote floating around in her. So when women say, I knew, from the time, conception occurred that I was pregnant. Well, that's impossible because you have no changes in your body whatsoever. You have no idea that anything for that first week. That's why you can't do a pregnancy test right after you have intercourse. It's not going to show if you're pregnant or not because your body hasn't made any changes whatsoever. It's the second week when it starts to implant here. That's when the woman's body starts to change and react, and the hormones are different, and that's when a pregnancy test can be detected. So we've got from conception, 1 week of floating around, 1 week of implantation. That first 2 weeks is called the germinal period. So we're in prenatal. The germinal period. Now, I know a lot of women, when they're pregnant, they'll say, I'm in my first trimester, second trimester, third trimester. And basically what they've done is take the 9 months of pregnancy and divide it up into 3 equal parts. Developmental psychology don't look at the prenatal period in that way. We divide it up into 3 sections, but they're different. The first is the germinal, and again, it goes for 2 weeks. First week after conception, and then implantation, and then the germinal period is done. It's over with. That's all it consists of. The second period is the embryonic period. doing this wrong. Did I spell embryonic? M-B-R. There's no O in there? It's not embryonic. I guess embryonic. Okay. I paused it.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Oh, I was like, oh my gosh.
No, I'm not doing it.
So you can pause it and then start again?
I just put end and then it says, are you sure you want to end? And then when I put not yet, it starts over again. So, okay. So we've got the germinal period, the embryonic period. The embryonic period starts at 2 weeks and it only lasts for 6 weeks. So it goes until the 8th week of the pregnancy. Organs are formed. So all the eyes, the ears, the lungs, the liver, the brain, the hands, the toes, everything pretty much is formed during the embryonic period. It's not completely developed and functioning, but all the body parts, everything is formed during this period. So this period is very important when it comes to dangers that can happen. So when a woman takes a teratogen is anything that the woman takes in that can harm the embryo, that can cause any kind of birth defects. So this period becomes the most critical period. Now, when we look at teratogens, there's all different kinds of things that are teratogens. Alcohol is a teratogen. If you drink during your pregnancy, you can cause harm to the embryo. Drugs, illegal or legal. Many drugs that women take legally, they're prescribed by their doctors, can cause harm to the embryo. Many of the psychological drugs that we give, the psychotropic drugs that we give, in our field to patients can cause this problem. So if they're going to get pregnant or they are pregnant, we tell them to stop taking those medications. Things like x-rays, not getting enough nutrition, eating things, certain things, illnesses like measles. There's a certain type of measles called German measles that if a woman gets it during this period of the pregnancy, the baby can become blind. So there's all kinds of teratogens that cause problems. The unfortunate part about this is that if you're trying to get pregnant and you go to the doctor, they're going to tell you take your prenatal vitamins because we know that women that are pregnant need different things. You need more folic acid. Additional folic acid helps prevent spina bifida. So, for example, we want you to take your prenatal vitamins early. Stop drinking, stop taking your medication. Certain ones, don't get X-rays. All these things we tell them. And so they're prepared and they're doing what they need to do. The problem becomes if you're not trying to get pregnant. Let's say you're not trying to get pregnant, you're using birth control and you think everything is good because you're using birth control, you're doing what you're supposed to do, you're going out on the weekends, you're drinking, you're taking your medication that the doctor has prescribed to you, you're even if you go to the dentist and they want to give x-rays, they still cover you with that big thing. So you're just living life normally and healthy for you and all is good, but you get pregnant. And then, so you miss your first period or you have a really light period and you think, oh, I'm just under stress. It's okay. I'm using birth control. It's no problem. And then you keep going along doing, again, your normal life. And then the second month you miss your period again and you think, okay, this is odd. So you take a pregnancy test and now you find out you're pregnant. The problem is you're probably already possibly maybe 8 weeks pregnant. You've already passed the embryonic period. You've already done all those things that you didn't know because you didn't know you were pregnant, and they can cause harm or birth defects and cause problems with the embryo and therefore are going to cause birth defects. So the embryonic period is very critical. And again, the problem is that sometimes women don't know they're pregnant because they're not trying to get pregnant. In fact, they're doing things to prevent pregnancy and they get pregnant. And they've exposed the embryo to the teratogens, which cause harm. So after the 8th week, prenatal development is the fetal period, and the fetal period is basically just growth because pretty much everything is already formed and developed. It's just more growth. The baby is growing, the organs are growing, they're becoming viable, they're becoming useful. And so then we have the delivery process, and there's a whole section on delivery, but we're not going to go into that. Okay, so then we've got that's the prenatal period. Okay, now we're going to go into infancy. Infancy is from ages 0 to 2. That's when the infant occurred. That's the whole period of infancy. Now, for many years, we believed that infants were pretty much born blank, that they really didn't have anything going on. But now we know that there are things going on with infant. First off, they have all 5 of their senses. They're not working at the level that they are for adults, but they are all working. We know that infants can see. They can see pretty clearly about 7 to 10 inches, which if you're breastfeeding, it's kind of like from your eyes to the baby's eyes. They can see that distance. Everything else is kind of blurry. They're not born being able to see all their colors. Remember, we talked about sensation and perception, the receptor sites for color. Anybody remember where they were? In the cones, remember the rods and cones are the receptor sites. The cones are where color is perceived, but they're not completely developed yet at birth. And so color comes later. Some colors are there, but not all colors. So we have our eyes are working. Hearing, we know that hearing develops in the womb. Some say 7, 8 months, the fetus can hear. And so when the baby is born, they've usually been hearing, the mother's voice for, months, maybe a couple months now. So when a baby is born and the mother speaks, it turns right to the mother because you've been used to hearing her voice. And so a lot of dads will, want to get in on that. So you'll see dads talking to the mother's belly. They kind of make fun of this in a lot of TV shows. So you'll see that happening because the fathers want the baby to recognize their voice when they come out as well. And for fathers that go away, like military dads, or have to be away for a while the woman is pregnant, they actually make headphones for the belly. So the dad can record the voice and then the mom can put the head things on her belly so then she can play the dad's voice for the child. Let me see. Smell. We know that infants have a sense of smell. After they're born, what they'll do to test this is they'll take women that are breastfeeding and they'll put a cotton ball under their armpits, and they'll take the cotton ball of the mother of the baby and the cotton ball of another mother who's nursing a baby, and the baby will always turn to the cotton ball of their mother. So we know they have a sense of smell and that they can remember that. So we have touch. I want to do last. What's what? I just left my brain. So hearing, sight, taste. Taste, yes. Infants, remember the 4 basic tastes: sweet, sour, salty, and bitter. Infants have all of those. And how do we know that? They give them solutions of different tastes, and they make a different facial expression, depending on which one you put in there. And all infants, or pretty much all infants, have a preference for sweet. So sweet, sour, salty, and bitter, they prefer sweet, which makes sense. We all prefer that mostly. And then the last sense is the sense of touch. Now, for many years, it was believed that when babies were born, they didn't have pain receptors. Because when you think about it, if you've ever seen a newborn baby that's been delivered vaginally, their head is kind of like cone shape because, the skull is soft. And so if it has to squeeze through the birth canal, it misshapens the head and it kind of comes out like that. So you would think that all babies come out crying. It's got to be painful to go through that. And, so much so that your head is being misshapen. How could they not be crying in pain? Very few babies come out crying. The doctors have to get them to cry in some way because they need them to take that first breath. So they go, from getting their oxygen through the umbilical cord to breathing. But most babies don't come out crying. So it was believed that babies didn't have this sense of pain, so much so that they would do a circumcision. You know what a circumcision is, right? On little boys without any anesthesia. Somebody finally dawned on them that these little boys are screaming, so obviously they must be in pain. Now, when they do a circumcision, they do give them a local. So there's different, about the pain receptor. Some say it kicks in pretty quickly right after delivery. So we know that the pain receptors are there. We also know that touch is very important because when babies are born prematurely, this is just a side note, you won't need to know this for the test. There's massage and kangaroo care. Kangaroo care is when you hold the baby skin to skin contact next to your heart rate, and it regulates their heart rate, their respiration, these preemies. And the skin to skin contact and this infant massage help them to get better quickly. They gain weight more faster, they get out of the hospital sooner. So we know the sense of touch is there and very important. So babies are born with all 5 senses. They are also born with many reflexes. Now, remember, a reflex is an automatic response to a stimulus that we don't really have control over, like blinking. If I put a puff of air in your face, your eyes are going to blink. It's going to be automatic. Babies have reflexes. Now, some of the reflexes they have go away. Many reflexes that babies are born with disappear. Some of the reflexes they have stay until adulthood, like the blinking reflex. And some reflexes, there's a couple of them that change. They're one way in infancy and a different way in adulthood. So babies are born, one of the reflexes that go away is the sucking reflex. Put anything in an infant's mouth, it's going to start sucking on it. And they need that for food, right? It makes sense. The grasping reflex, you've all done this with newborns. They have their palm out, you put your finger in their palm, they grasp onto it. It's called the grasping reflex. Again, it's automatic. They do it automatically without, as long as they get stimulated in that area, they're going to grasp on. Most of you don't have the grasping reflex. If I could touch the palm of your hand, you're not going to automatically close it. Okay, they have, let's see, the rooting reflex. The rooting reflex is when you touch a baby's cheek, it automatically turns its mouth in that direction. It's called rooting. It's like rooting around for food, trying to find it. And most women, if you've ever held a newborn, a baby up to you, and its cheeks are against your breast, it's going to start rooting around looking for food. It doesn't know it's a breast. It just knows that anytime, because you can put your hand up here and it's going to do the same thing, the rooting reflex. Now, all of those leave. Blinking reflex stays, but sucking, grasping, rooting, those reflexes leave. Some other ones, swimming reflex. If you register at a hospital that you're going to have a baby, you're going to get all kinds of information. We have the best, greatest, latest toy, the best, high chair, the best everything. And you're going to get advertisements that are going to say, I can teach your newborn to swim, in 30 minutes. There's no real teaching to it. If you take a newborn and you put them in water and you put them underwater, they will automatically hold their breath. It's a reflex. They will thrash their arms around like they're to get to the side or to get to the top or to kind of like keep their head above water. This is the swimming reflex. It's there with infants automatically. It goes away pretty quickly. This is why when you see kids going to the mommy and me classes, maybe they're 6 months old, the moms are having to dunk them down and go down with them to teach them how to hold their breath because they've lost the swimming reflex. So these things, lose pretty quickly. The reflex that changes, one of the ones that changes is called the Babinski reflex, B-A-B. I don't remember how to spell it. I don't know if I have the Babinski on here. You won't need to know it for the test, but it's an interesting reflex because if you watch any hospital shows or emergency shows and somebody comes into the emergency room and they say, Babinski is positive or negative because they're checking for neurological damage. So what happens with a baby, if this is the bottom of your foot, and I took an item, this pencil, and I put it down from your toes down what's going to happen to your toes? They're going to curl in. That's the Babinski reflex. That's what you want to happen. That's a normal response. But with infants, if you take the bottom of an infant's foot and you do this to the bottom of it, the toes spread out. So it's opposite of what happens with adults. It changes in adulthood. But again, they check these things to look for neurological change. Okay, so infants are born with their reflexes and their all of their senses, and they're also born with what we call temperament. Temperament is what we believe is the biological base of personality. So we talk about your personality with the nature nurture controversy. This is the nature part of your personality, is the temperament, the part that you're born with. So when they look at infants, at newborns, they see that they have different, again, kind of like different personalities. They react differently to different situations. So they've come up with 3 different temperaments. Um, uh, the first one is a difficult baby. We don't in our country tend to like difficult babies because they cry all the time. They're fussy, they cry, they're not on a regular schedule. They just seem to cry for no reason, and they don't eat at the same time, they don't sleep at the same time, they don't warm up to new people, they don't like change or new situations. They just seem to be difficult, which is why we call them difficult, because they are just have that kind of reaction to the world. Then we have the opposite, which is the easy babies. These babies are very easygoing. They put themselves on a schedule, so they eat at the same time, they sleep at the same time. They don't cry or fuss very much. They're just kind of there. They're happy. They're calm. We, in our culture in America, we like the easy babies. Then there's the slow to warm. They're kind of, if you've got the difficult and the easy, the slow to warm are kind of in the middle. The slow to warm temperament babies, they're not, again, it's difficult. They don't cry all the time. If they're hungry, they'll cry. They'll cry if they need something. But one of the biggest differences between them and the easy babies is that they have more difficulty adjusting to a new situation. That's why they call them slow to warm up. It's slower for them to warm up to new people. It's slower for them to warm up to a new situation. So let's say you have a slow to warm baby and they sleep at the same time, so their nap is at the same time. But today you have to go out during nap time. So then they start fussing and because they're not in their bed. It's their nap time and it's not in their bed. An easy baby would just go with it. They would just sleep in the car seat or with you holding them or, in the carrier. A slow to warm baby would have difficulty with that. A difficult baby, they're just going to cry all the time. So we have these 3 different temperaments. Now, again, here in the US, we like the easy babies. We take care of them. We pick them up more. We hold them more. But think about, could there be a culture, a situation, a life situation, environmental situation, and when actually a difficult baby would do better, that they would thrive better, that they would get more attention than an easy baby would? So if you think about it, if you think about third world countries where, the parents are just trying to find food and just trying to survive. Okay, so that's their life, their environment, their primary caregivers are just, they're just trying to make it. They're just trying to get enough food for the family. They're stressed out. They're worried. If you're an easy baby and you're just laying in the crib, nobody's picking you up. You're not crying. They're not picking you up. You're not getting a lot of attention. But you're a difficult baby and you're crying all the time. Well, very few people can be in a room with a crying baby and try not to calm that baby or soothe that baby. So if you're the parent and you're trying to find food and you're trying to, do this and that and you're stressed, but you've got a crying baby, you're going to pick that baby up. If you've got an easy baby and the baby isn't crying, you're not going to pick that baby up. So who's going to get more attention? The difficult baby. So they're going to be more likely to thrive because we need attention. Babies need attention from adults to survive. So babies are born with our senses, reflexes, and our temperament, which is the basis of our personality. Okay, let's do that. Okay, so that's we're still in infancy. When we talk about, remember we talked about the 2 theorists, Piaget and Erikson. Piaget has cognitive stages of development, and his first stage during infancy is called sensory motor. Sensory motor. The sensory motor, he calls it the sensory motor stage because what children have to deal with is their senses, and motor means movement. So they're starting to move. Remember, an infant goes from just laying there, not even being able to hold up its neck, to by the time it's 2 years old, they can walk and run and do different things. So there's a lot of motor changes that are going on during infancy. So Piaget calls the sensory motor stage that's how they're interacting with the environment. That's how they're getting their stimulation from the environment. And remember, doing this assimilation and accommodation with getting new stimulus. They're moving around, they're getting new stimulus, and then they're either assimilating or accommodating. One of the things that happens during the sensory motor stage is what Piaget calls object permanence. Object permanence is the idea that when we can no longer see an object, it's still permanent. We know when we have object permanence that if we can't see something, it still exists. Okay. I know that my car is out, parked in the street. I can't see my car, but I know it's there. Assuming it's there, I'm assuming nobody stole it. But, in my mind, my car still exists. Even if somebody stole it, my car still exists. It doesn't disappear because I can't see it. He says, excuse me, that infants prior to the age of 8 months do not have object permanence. They think when something goes away, they can't see it, out of sight, out of mind, it's gone, it disappears. And he did this test to show this with infants and moms. So we'd have the mom sitting here. They would sit on the floor with an infant, let's say a 12-month-old. So they're sitting across from the mom and they're playing with the toy, let's say a set of keys, and they're playing with it. They're engaged in it. They really like this toy. The mom takes the toy away from the baby, puts it on the floor, and covers it with a blanket. If the baby does not have object permanence, if it's 6 months old, it's not going to look for 4 months old. It's not going to look for the keys. And so in Piaget's mind, because it didn't look for the keys, the baby's figured if I can't see it, it no longer exists. So why would I look for it? Once the baby develops object permanence, it's let's say 8 months old or the 12-month-old, it's playing with the keys. The mom takes the keys away, puts it on the floor, covers it up. The baby just lifts up the blanket and gets the keys because it knows that even though it can't see the keys, the keys still exist. And that's object permanence. It's one of the things that Piaget says our cognitive abilities grow and develop during infancy. Okay. Then for Erickson, the first stage in infancy is called trust versus mistrust, and we went through that already. So that's what's going on for Erickson during infancy. The second stage for Erickson is autonomy versus shame and doubt. So for Erickson, we have in the infancy stage, because it's 0 to 2, trust versus mistrust is 0 to 1. It's in the first year. And then autonomy versus shame and doubt is from 1 to 3. So it starts in infancy and, and goes into a little bit of early adulthood. Autonomy versus shame and doubt, what Erickson is talking about is that on its own, it starts to have its own ideas. So it starts exploring its environment. It has movement now. Most children by 1 year old are walking. So it has freedom to move around without the parents moving it, like when it's, very young and it can't move. So let's say a mom came into my room here and she sat down and she put the baby down. So the baby is going to sit there for a while. It's going to look around. It's going to look at mom. Mom's okay, smiling, baby's good. And then the baby may get up and start exploring things. It may come over to where the computer is and want to push the buttons. It may come up here and want to, get the markers or do some things. That's a sense of autonomy, the sense of I can be autonomous. I can be separate from my primary care. No, every time the baby gets up to explore, the mom says no and puts the baby down on the floor. No, you can't move. You need to stay here. You need to sit here. Then the baby's going to develop this sense of of doubt or shame of like, well, my inner thoughts tell me that I should explore, but my primary caregiver is saying, no, I shouldn't do that. So something must be wrong with me. It makes me doubt myself. It makes me feel ashamed that I have these thoughts. So the child, again, remember with Erickson, you have kind of a positive outcome or a negative outcome, this crisis of which way you're going to be. Child develops a sense of autonomy. They have, it starts to develop their self-esteem. They start to feel better about who they are, trust themselves. If they have this sense of shame, then they don't. And again, for Erickson, that will stay with the child. Okay. So Piaget's first stage, sensory motor. For Erickson in infancy, we have trust versus mistrust, and then the beginning of autonomy versus shame and doubt. For Freud, again, we're going to do that during the personality theory. Another thing that happens during the infancy period, it's not Piaget or Erickson. But it is an oral stage, but proceed into that. We believe that attachment is like the bonding between the primary caregiver and the infant. Attachment can happen with anybody. It can happen with the mother, the father, the grandmother, the siblings. We can attach to several people. But for attachment to occur, it used to be believed that whoever fed the baby is who the baby attached to. And so that was usually the mom, especially if she was breastfeeding, then the baby was believed to be attaching to her because she was feeding the baby. So many dads would want to feed the baby, but the mom is breastfeeding. So the dad maybe the mom would pump and put some breast milk in a bottle so the dad could feed the baby, or they would sometimes supplement with formula so the dad could feed the baby so that the baby could attach to the dad. So for many years, it was believed that attachment occurred through feeding. Whoever fed the baby attached to. Then a guy by the name of Harlow came along. Now, Harlow was doing research with monkeys. He was looking at the socialization and what would happen if you separated a baby monkey from the mother monkey. What would happen with the socialization process. And so he was raising baby monkeys and separating from their moms. And in their cage, there would be a water bottle and a blanket. And then the research assistants would come in and feed the baby monkeys. So given the fact that Freud believed, and that, pretty much all of his theory and everybody else believed that attachment came from feeding, you would think that the baby monkeys would get attached then to the research assistant. Excuse me. But what Harlow found, he wasn't studying attachment at the time, but what he found is that when they removed the blanket from the baby's cage to wash it, the baby monkeys would go crazy as if it had been separated from its mother. And so Harlow kind of changed all of his research and kind of looked at attachment and what really causes attachment. So what he did with these baby monkeys is he took, he made these like surrogate mothers, and it was like a wire round cylinder thing and had this weird looking head on it that he made. And he made 2 of them for each baby monkey. One of the surrogate mothers had a blanket wrapped around it. The other surrogate mother had the bottle coming out of it. So one was the feeding mother, one was what he called the contact comfort mother. And he put them in the cages with the babies. And then, he would, have this for going on for several days or weeks. And then he would expose the baby monkeys to something very frightening, a very loud noise or something else. And the baby monkeys would go to the contact comfort mother, not the feeding mother. And so he felt that this was showing that they were more attached to the contact comfort mother, not to the feeding mother. Because when you're scared, you're going to go to whoever it is that you're attached to comfort you. One of the most famous pictures of Harlow's monkeys is the baby monkey is holding on with its back. It's holding on to the contact comfort mother. It's holding on to the contact comfort mother, but it's trying to feed off the other mother. It won't even leave the contact comfort mother to go to the other mother to feed. So this kind of changed our whole idea about attachment and what causes attachment. So we now believe that what causes attachment is what Harlow called contact comfort, which is eye contact with the baby, physical contact with the baby, skin to skin contact, looking in the baby's eyes, talking to the baby, caressing the baby. All those things, holding the baby, comforting the baby, is what causes attachment. So we now know that you could, in theory, never ever feed your baby and they can still attach to you if you're doing all these other things. If you've got the eye contact, the physical contact, the touch, the looking at, the talking to, all that interaction, the holding of the baby is going to cause attachment, even if you never feed the baby. So all of these things are important to create what's a healthy attachment or a secure attachment with the baby. And that's why they can attach to several people. So you can have the mom, who's doing these things. And so the baby's attaching to her, the dad, the grandmother, the daycare worker, the siblings, anybody who's doing those things with the baby's going to attach to. So that's the attachment process. Now, and an extension of that, so that was Harlow's research, coming up with the idea of this contact comfort is what creates attachment. Then Mary Ainsworth came along and she looked at babies and their attachment and discovered that not all babies have a secure attachment with their parents or with anybody. If nobody does all these things, if your baby is eating and you're propping the bottle, meaning that the baby can't hold the bottle, so you put a pillow under here and put the bottle in, so you don't hold the baby even when you're feeding it, you don't talk to the baby, the baby's getting food and diaper changed and warmth, but nobody's interacting with the baby, then it can have an insecure attachment. And she talked about a couple of different types of insecure attachment. Avoidant is one where the babies just kind of avoid the primary caregiver. There's disorganized, and these different types of attachment. We don't need to go into that much detail in developmental class. We go into a lot more detail here. But then one of the questions becomes, for most women and men, they have to work after their babies are born. We don't give a lot of time off for, care afterwards. So, but let's say you take 4 months off. And so you're with your baby for 4 months, you're doing all these things, you're creating a secure attachment. Now you have to go back to work. So your baby goes to the daycare worker. And let's say they're with the daycare worker 40 hours a week. And then they're with you the rest of the time. Is the baby, or do you want the baby to attach to the daycare worker? Yes, you do. Because if they don't attach to the daycare worker, what that means is that 40 hours a week, your baby, nobody's interacting with it, talking to it, holding it, comforting it, having eye contact, all those things that attachment occurs. You don't want your baby in daycare for 40 hours a week with nobody interacting with it. That's not healthy. So, of course, if your daycare worker is doing all these things, your baby is going to attach to the daycare worker. But that's a good thing. It means that the good things are happening while you're gone at work. The fear, I think, for most parents is that, will the baby become more attached to the daycare worker than to me? Well, if my baby has a good, strong attachment with me and a good attachment with the daycare worker, it will still be more attached to me. I've had those months alone with the baby, and I'm still getting, every night time, on the weekends time, they're still going to have that good, strong attachment with me. Now, if the baby has an insecure attachment with me and a secure attachment with the daycare worker, then yes, they'll have a stronger attachment with the daycare worker, but that's on me because I didn't create that good, strong attachment by doing all those things that make that happen. Now, does this mean that when you drop your kids off at daycare, sometimes they won't cry? Of course. Does it mean that sometimes when you go to pick them up, that they won't want to come with you, that they'll want to stay with the daycare worker? Yes, of course. They're having fun. They're doing something they like. It doesn't mean they're not attached to you or that they don't have a good attachment to you. It's just kind of the circumstances. So remember this when you have children and you put them in daycare, that if your child does not have a secure attachment with the daycare worker, something's going on. It's probably not a good situation. The baby can't tell you that, but you need to look for those sorts of things. Okay. I think we're going to end here. We've been going about almost 50 minutes now. And so we will pick up and continue with developmental psychology in the next section. Oh, where's my little guy? So hopefully you're all healthy. And
relax, calm down now. Don't stress. Take it easy.
You're a good teacher, Mom. Your lectures are very interesting.
But are they understandable? And like you understand the terms that, that I'm